In my recent video on the inflation that's striking Canada, which is also striking the rest of the world, I seem to have angered at least one Milton Friedman follower who has the belief that the only thing that causes inflation is printing money. And this, of course, is wrong. And this also is a part of some larger conspiracy to rob the public, which is a common view that these libertarian types do tend to have. This is also an example of why libertarians often resort to conspiracy theories and often are conspiracy theorists themselves. The problem is that Friedman's conception of inflation is just simply ridiculous. And that's not just the opinion of some guy on YouTube, but actual economists as well. And this pretty much goes for the rest of so-called libertarian economic ideology. So as for Milton Friedman's ideas on inflation, we're going to show the gigantic logical flaw that runs right through the entire theory. To start, inflation is not when the government prints money. Excess money supply can be the cause of inflation, but creating new money is not the definition of it. Inflation is the rate at which prices of a collection of commodities, called a basket, increases over a given period of time. This means that a particular selection of goods and services will be used for the purposes of measuring. Usually they exclude items that are prone to large fluctuations, such as fuel prices. Generally, they are items that people purchase every day, or are common purchases made by people in a society. Collectively, every day. They are mostly necessities like transportation, food, and housing. Now on to Milton Friedman himself and his ideas on inflation. This is how economists see money in an economy. M is equal to the supply of money in the economy at any given time. V is the velocity of money, meaning how many times the average dollar is spent in a given time period. P is the average price of goods and services. Y is the total quantity of all goods and services sold during the time period in question. So, if there are 100 goods and services that are sold for $10 each, on average, then that means a total of $1,000 worth of transactions took place. According to Friedman, money growth equals inflation. The idea here is that simply increasing the money supply, there will be a corresponding increase in the price of goods and services. This devaluation of the dollar only occurs when there's more money in the system. However, this view is overly simplistic and leaves out something important: real-world context and social and economic forces. The problem with Friedman's model is that he makes certain assumptions about each variable in the equation. The problem is these assumptions are incorrect, and then they in turn, as a result, give a very skewed and incorrect view of what inflation is, and thus an incorrect definition of what it is. M, that which is money, is easily defined and identified, and only the central bank can affect its supply, which it can do with autonomy and precision. V, the velocity of money, is related to people's habits and the structure of the financial system. It is, therefore, relatively constant. P, the economy is so competitive that neither firms nor workers are free to change what they charge for their goods and services without there having been a change in the underlying forces driving supply and demand in the market. Y, the economy automatically tends towards full employment, and thus Y, the existing volume of goods and services, is as large as it can be at any given moment, although it grows over time. When we understand that this is his definition or his explanation of the variables in the equation, then we begin to see why he gets this incorrect idea that money growth is therefore the cause of inflation in an economy. It is theoretical here that P cannot change on its own, and Y is currently assumed to be as high as it can be given the current level of technological development and availability of resources. When we look at V, we see that it is insisted that it is constant. So what remains? Obviously, we see that P is the only variable that is assumed to have the power to change. By working on these assumptions, it is only logical to immediately look at P when we see any fluctuation we observe or introduce. This is why P is automatically said to be the cause when inflation occurs. It is from his work, The Optimum Quantity of Money, that we get his ideas of where inflation come from. In it, he uses the example of a helicopter just flying in and dropping money into the money supply. And this, in true libertarian fashion, is an overly simplistic example intended to illustrate how things are done, which lead to a terribly incorrect view. So what exactly are his views when it comes to inflation and the particular variables when dealing with this whole situation? With this problem, we logically have three possible maneuvers. Y could rise to 200. However, that's impossible because it's already at its maximum. V could fall to 2.5, but Friedman emphatically states in his work that it is constant. P could rise to 20, meaning money growth equals inflation, which is what Friedman's theory claims. This is already presupposed to be the answer because of the limitations that Friedman puts on his own work. Y cannot move because it is the natural rate of employment according to Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps. V is directly related to people's demand for cash. So when people hold more cash, V naturally falls. But Friedman insists that V is relatively constant. So must be the demand for cash. It implies that the Fed has increased the money supply beyond the demand for it, and that this demand essentially has remained at its original level, meaning that the Fed has just printed more money or increased the money supply for seemingly no reason. Or if you do ask some libertarians, it's a part of some evil conspiracy to rob the public of their wealth. The only possible outcome is an increase in the money supply by people who hold this view of inflation, is that people go out and spend this money on goods and services. But they don't purchase any more or any less because they are also assuming in aggregate more does not exist. The only result is that the supplier of goods and services bid up their prices. Voila! Money growth leads to inflation. As we can see, there hasn't been any investigation as to why inflation occurs. There is only a preset assumption which can only lead to one conclusion. With a simple critical eye, we can see that employment is not at full. There is a greater demand for labor than there is supply available, much to the lamentation of the bourgeoisie. If you do increase the money supply, it's very possible that people will go out and spend that money, which businesses will gladly accept and use to reinvest in more products and services to meet the increased demand. It should also be noted that the velocity of money is also not a constant. Consumption of goods and services does not remain at a near fixed rate. It fluctuates all the time given various material conditions consumer and the economy find themselves in. As an example, consumer spending tends to decline during a recession. It's only natural that people become more concerned that the economy is going to crash. They tend to begin saving more money than they normally do. With these new real-world ideas, we have a combination of factors. The money supply is increased during a recession as people are also beginning to save more out of concern for future expenses. Obviously, this is done to combat the effects of recession, which would include people saving more than usual. It's also possible for a rise in Y and a fall in V. This would make perfect economic sense. It should also be quite obvious that there isn't always the Fed that creates new money. Banks make a great deal of it themselves via fractional reserve banking. When we acknowledge this, it completely alters the possibilities surrounding the equation of exchange and correspondingly the possible causes of inflation. To finish this all off, we need only look at this bad metaphor that Friedman uses of the helicopter just coming in and then dropping money into the money supply. It's not just a bad metaphor. This is the only way in which his actual model of inflation can work, that the Fed just snaps its fingers and then new money just magically appears in the economy for, again, seemingly no reason whatsoever, thus creating a larger circulation of money. In reality, the Fed purchases government debt from the public. The Fed loans to banks through the discount window, or the Fed's adjustment of reserve requirements so that banks can make more loans from the same volume of deposits. This is all a conscious and voluntary act with the private sector. You cannot force anyone to sell a treasury bond in exchange for new cash. You cannot force a private bank to accept a loan from the Fed. Private banks cannot force customers to accept loans. There has to be a corresponding demand. Now we have a clear picture of why he uses the example of a helicopter that just drops money into the economy, because that is the only way for his interpretation of inflation to actually work. And from that, and understanding these new ways of looking at the variables in the equation, that we can begin to look at instances where increasing the money supply didn't cause inflation. And in fact, in at least one case, the opposite happened. From 1968 through 1972, consumer price inflation averaged 4.6%. M did rise, however, and largely proportional to the increase in P. As the price of oil skyrocketed, so did the cost of production for many, many U.S. businesses. Because there is a lag between purchasing inputs and selling output, most firms must borrow money, working capital, to bridge the gap. As the ripple effect of the OPEC price increases moved through the economy, the demand for cash by these businesses rose. Those businesses went out and borrowed more money, which increased the supply. Therefore, the rising prices led to an increase in the supply of money and not the other way around. There. So we could see from this example, very real world example, that the opposite can happen. Prices go up and then the money supply increases as a result. The opposite of what Friedman claims is the only, and the people who follow him claim, that it happens. Now, can you have inflation from having too much money in the economy? Of course. The three best examples are probably the Weimar Republic and post-World War I Germany, where they were forced to pay war reparations by continually printing more and more and more money to pay off the people that they were in combat with, and that led to inflation. The example of Zimbabwe. Once Robert Mugabe took over and they started seizing factories and farms from the white colonizers and started handing it back to the black population, the Africans who actually live there, the British companies pulled out. And not only that, the British companies that normally purchase things from there stopped buying and started going elsewhere, which means there was a sudden and catastrophic contraction of the economy, meaning that the economy drastically shrunk immediately, leaving too much money in the economy. There wasn't a correct corresponding amount of money in the economy. So in this case, having too much money did cause inflation. The same thing happened with Venezuela. Once the massive amount of sanctions and embargoes were put against the country by the United States for daring to elect someone who didn't want their country to be a colony of the U.S., their economy suddenly contracted. And now they were left with too much money and a shocking lack of economic activity as a result of the actions, the unjust and horribly inhumane actions of the United States. So yes, having too much money in an economy can cause inflation. The problem is that it is not the definition of inflation itself. Inflation is when you have prices of a particular basket of commodities, with the specific intention of measuring inflation, increase over a particular period of time. Printing more money can cause inflation, but it is not the definition of it. And we have mostly Milton Friedman to thank for these horribly incorrect ideas that do go around regarding inflation itself. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.